The rain had already soaked through Chris's shirt by the time the shouting stopped. Water dripped from his hair, blurring the warm glow of the living room into trembling streaks of light. He stood in the center of the floor, a bank receipt crushed in his fist, the paper softening under the storm seeping from his fingers. His breath came shallow, ragged, as if every inhale risked breaking him further. Across the room, his father's silhouette loomed near the window, rigid as an old tree struck too many times by lightning. "Explain this," his father growled, pointing at the stack of letters on the table. Red stamped notices, overdue bills, and the quiet evidence of everything Chris had covered for years lay scattered like a crime scene. His sister crossed her arms, jaw tight, while his brother paced in restless circles, muttering under his breath. Chris swallowed, trying to gather words that didn't want to come. "I paid the mortgage again," he said softly, barely audible beneath the pattering rain. "And the medical bill, the car payment. You asked. You didn't tell us about this," his mother whispered, lifting one trembling envelope with his name printed across the top. "A loan in your account. Another one. How could you hide that?" Her voice carried no accusation, only fear, but the room twisted her tone into something sharper. "I wasn't hiding anything," Chris replied. His hand shook, the wet paper slipping. "I was trying to keep this family afloat. You were drowning. Someone had to do something." His brother stopped pacing, a sudden, violent halt. "Don't act like a hero. You think being generous gives you some moral high ground." His voice curled into something poisonous. "You think money gives you the right to live however you want." Chris felt the shift before he understood it. A new tension, colder than the storm outside, filled the air. His father stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "We heard something," he said, the word dragged out like stones. "About you. About the man you've been seeing." The room went still. Even the rain seemed to hush. Chris's heartbeat thudded painfully in his chest. "You went through my messages," he murmured. "It wasn't a question." His brother smirked. "You bring shame into this house the same way you bring money. Quiet, sneaky, hoping no one notices. But we noticed." His mother's hand rose to her mouth. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't need to. The silence around her said enough. Chris took a step back, his shoes squelching against the soaked threshold where he'd first entered. He wished the shadows would swallow him, that the storm would claim the noise so he could breathe again. "I'm the same person," he whispered. "Nothing about me changed." "You changed everything," his father snapped. "A man loving another man. This is not how we raised you." The word loving hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. Chris's breath hitched. "Why does who I love erase everything I've done for you?" he asked. His voice trembled but held. "The nights I covered the bills you couldn't pay. The mornings I worked double shifts so you wouldn't lose the house. Did any of that matter?" His father jabbed a finger toward him. "We didn't ask you to turn into this." Chris closed his eyes, rainwater and tears indistinguishable. "You asked for everything else," he said softly. "My time, my money, my future. You asked without ever once asking how I was doing." His brother barked a humorless laugh. "Don't play the victim." He stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. "You're a sin. That's what you are." The word dropped like a hammer on Chrissy's chest. He staggered back, breath faltering as if the room had sucked all oxygen from his lungs. His mother flinched but didn't speak. Her silence carved a deeper wound than any accusation. A glass shattered behind them. His sister had dropped her cup, the fragment spreading across the floor like tiny white teeth. She looked at him with something almost like apology, but fear swallowed it before it could reach her eyes. His father's voice struck again. "If you're choosing that life, you don't stay under my roof." Chris stared at him. Rain dripped from his fingertips to the hardwood floor, each drop echoing like a clock counting down the last moments of the life he'd known. "So that's it," he whispered. "After everything." "Get out," his father said. The house felt colder than the storm waiting outside. Chris turned, numb, walking toward the door with slow, measured steps. His wet shoes left faint, dark prints trailing behind him, ghosts of every sacrifice, every moment of loyalty. He paused at the threshold, gripping the doorknob, waiting for someone, anyone, to call his name. His mother shifted, as if something in her wanted to speak, but nothing escaped her lips. The storm welcomed him violently. Wind whipped against his face, rain drumming on his skin. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning under his weight. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the street in stark white. His brother's voice cut through the doorway behind him. He should have never been part of this family. The door slammed shut. For a moment, Chris just stood there, breathing in the cold as though it was the only truth left in the world. The streetlights blurred through the curtain of rain, turning into soft halos shimmering like distant promises. He stepped off the porch, feeling the mud cling to his shoes, the weight of the storm sinking into him. Every breath hurt, but each step pulled him farther from the voices that had caged him for years. His hands shook violently as he wiped the rain from his face, though it did nothing to stem the steady flow. He walked toward the empty road, the night stretching endlessly ahead. A faint rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, low and mournful, as if the world itself sighed with him. Chris didn't look back. He couldn't. The home he had held together for so long had chosen to unmake him in a single night. But what Chris didn't know was that his journey was only beginning. Cold air clung to Chris's skin as he trudged down the empty street, the storm easing but not relenting. The rain settled into a thin mist, whispering across the asphalt like a sheet of quiet sorrow. His clothes clung heavily to him, carrying the smell of damp cotton and the faint trace of the home he had just been cast out of. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, as though he were walking through the thick residue of a life collapsing behind him. By the time he reached the park at the edge of town, night had spirited away the last of the streetlights. A flickering lamp near an old playground buzzed faintly, its glow dim and unsteady. Chris moved toward a bench beneath it, sinking down with the exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for far too long. His breath formed pale clouds in the cool air, each exhale trembling like a frightened confession. He rubbed his palms together, trying to summon warmth from friction alone, but his fingers felt stiff and foreign. He had always imagined leaving his family someday, on his own terms, with dignity, but he had never imagined being pushed out into the dark like a sinner from a story told to scare children. For years, he had been their anchor, their safety net, their quiet provider. Tonight, he was an exile. The bench groaned under him as he leaned back, tilting his head toward the sky. The clouds drifted apart for a moment, revealing a sliver of moon, thin and bruised-looking. He stared at it, wondering if somewhere beyond that pale, faraway light his life still had shape, meaning, direction. All he felt now was a raw hollowness that threatened to swallow him whole. He dipped a hand into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. It was soaked, the leather darkened and softened from the rain. He opened it slowly. A few bills clung together. Beyond that, only an ID and a faded photo of him and his siblings as children. He traced the edges of their small, smiling faces. None of them knew the weight he carried back then. None of them knew the weight he carried now. Maybe they never wanted to. His stomach clenched as a sudden wave of hunger swept through him. He hadn't eaten since morning, too preoccupied with keeping his family from falling apart. Funny how sacrifice tasted sweet when you believed it mattered. Now it tasted like bitterness and regret. The night deepened around him. Cars passed occasionally on the main road, their headlights cutting thin slices of brightness across the park's darkness. Each time, Chris instinctively straightened, hoping, he didn't even know for what. Recognition? Rescue? Some miracle of humanity that might pull him from this vacuum? But every car continued on. A memory surfaced uninvited. Him laughing with Mark, the man he had quietly loved for months. They had been sitting by a riverside, knees touching, listening to water rustle past. Mark had brushed a leaf from Chris's hair, smiling with a gentleness that made Chris believe in the softness of the world. For a moment he had felt seen, not as a provider, not as a wallet, but as a man deserving of affection. He had planned to tell his family eventually, once courage felt less like an expensive luxury. Now the memory weighed heavy, sharp around the edges. He wondered if Mark would answer his call. He wondered if reaching out would drag him into trouble. Mark had always asked, "Are you safe telling them?" Chris had believed it would be difficult but survivable. He had underestimated cruelty. A gust of wind swept across the park, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke. Chris hunched further, gripping the sides of his jacket. The cold seeped deeper, settling into bone. His body shivered with an involuntary rhythm, each tremor rattling through him like a quiet plea. He stood, unable to stay still any longer, and began to walk again. The path wound past darkened houses, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. Behind those curtains, families ate dinner, argued, laughed, existed. Chris felt like a ghost passing through a world that no longer had space for him. His shoes squelched against the pavement, the sound loud in the hush of the late hour. He passed a closed bakery, the faint scent of sweet dough lingering at the doorway. Hunger clawed at him again. He moved on before the longing could hurt more. As he rounded the corner into a narrow street, his legs wobbled. Exhaustion hit him in a sudden wave. He pressed a hand against a brick wall, steadying himself as his vision blurred for a moment. His heart pounded too quickly, every beat echoing like a warning. He pushed forward, stubbornness his only remaining strength. The rain eased into a gentle drizzle, softening the night. Chris approached the small stone church at the end of the block, its stained-glass windows dark except for one narrow basement pane glowing faintly with amber light. He paused, drawn by it. The glow shimmered through the wet air, warm and inviting like a fireplace on a winter night. For a moment, he wondered if stepping toward it would burn him or heal him. His knees buckled before he could decide. He fell to the curb, catching himself clumsily on scraped palms. The world spun, colors blending into muddled swirls. He tried to rise but couldn't. The cold had seeped too deeply. His strength was draining like water escaping through cracks. A soft sound escaped him, a mix between a sigh and a sob. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to his arm. The distant hum of the city felt far away, unreal. All he wanted was one warm voice, one hand reaching down instead of pushing him away. Footsteps approached, muffled by the wet ground. Chris barely registered them at first, thinking it was just the wind shifting. But then a gentle voice broke through the fog of his exhaustion, steady, calm, touched with quiet concern. "Hey, are you all right?" Chris's eyes fluttered open. A blurred figure knelt beside him, the glow from the church window outlining a face he couldn't yet distinguish. Then a warm hand touched his shoulder. He didn't know it yet, but this stranger's simple gesture was about to pull his life in an entirely new direction. The voice cut through the haze like a small lantern in a cavern, soft, steady, carefully measured so it wouldn't startle him. Chris blinked, his vision swimming as the world slowly stitched itself back together. Kneeling beside him was an older man, raincoat hanging loose over narrow shoulders, silver hair plastered to his forehead. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet worry that made Chris feel seen in a way that didn't sting. "Can you hear me?" the man asked gently. Chris nodded, though the motion made his head spin. The man offered his arm, and Chris clung to it with trembling fingers, letting himself be lifted to his feet. His legs threatened to fold again, but the stranger's grip was firm enough to steady him. "Come on," the man murmured. "Let's get you inside. You look frozen to the bone." The small basement door beneath the church stays creaked open, releasing a faint breath of warm air scented with soup, old wood, and something comforting he couldn't place. Chris hesitated, but the cold gnawing at his ribs pushed him forward. The man guided him down the steps, closing the door gently behind them to keep the night outside where it belonged. Inside, the basement glowed with golden lamplight. A kettle steamed on a small metal stove. Blankets were neatly stacked on a table. Folding chairs ringed a circle where someone had left a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. This wasn't a shelter meant for crowds. It felt more like a sanctuary built from what little one man could offer. "Sit," the stranger said softly. Chris lowered himself into a chair, wincing as his muscles tightened from the cold. The man removed his coat, draping it over Chris's shoulders. Warmth seeped in slowly, like dawn inching over a horizon. "My name is Jonah," the man said as he filled a mug with steaming water. "I help keep this place open at night. Nothing fancy, but it's warm." He handed the mug to Chris. "Drink." Chris wrapped his hands around it, letting the heat sink into his shaking palms before taking a careful sip. The warmth spread through his chest, loosening something that had been clenched since the moment he walked out of his family's house. Jonah pulled up a chair across from him. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Chris stared into the steam rising from the mug. "Not anymore." Jonah didn't ask why. He didn't push, didn't prod, didn't tilt his head with that familiar mixture of curiosity and pity that Chris had learned to fear. Instead, he waited. A stillness in the room invited truth, but not before Chris was ready. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Rain pattered against the small window, soft like fingertips on glass. Chris breathed deeply, the tension in his shoulders slowly unraveling. "It was my family," he finally said, voice barely louder than a whisper. "They told me to leave." Jonah nodded once, silent encouragement urging him on. "For years," Chris continued, "I paid every bill they couldn't. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, took loans I'm still drowning in. All they ever saw was what I could give them, not who I was." He swallowed hard, throat tightening. "And tonight, they found out about me, about the person I care for. They called me a sin. Then they pushed me out like all those years meant nothing." Jonah exhaled through his nose, long and slow, like he was absorbing the weight of every syllable. He didn't say he understood. He didn't need to. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Chris." "Well, Chris," Jonah said, "you're safe here tonight. No one's going to throw you out into the cold." Something fragile in Chris's chest cracked at the softness of that promise. Jonah stood and lifted a thick blanket from the table, placing it around Chris's shoulders. The wool scratched lightly against his neck, but the warmth was immediate, grounding. "Why are you helping me?" Chris asked. The question escaped before he could stop it, shaped by a lifetime of conditional affection. Jonah looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone once helped me when I thought I didn't deserve it, and because no one should face a night like this alone." The sincerity in his voice left Chris unsteady, unsure where to place his kind of gentleness. He watched Jonah move around the small room with slow, deliberate steps, adjusting the lamp, stirring the pot on the stove, checking the back door. There was a ritualistic calm about him, a practiced tenderness that suggested years of caring for people the world had forgotten. When Jonah returned, he set a bowl of soup on the table. "Eat what you can. Rest after. You've been carrying too much." Chris took a spoonful, the broth warming him from the inside out. Each bite unfurled something in him. Grief first, then gratitude, then the faint, aching reminder that kindness still existed. Jonah sat again, close but not crowding. "If you want to talk," he said, "I'll listen. If you need silence, I'll sit with you in it." Chris stared into the soup, steam curling up like soft ghosts. "Silence is okay," he murmured. So they sat together, saying nothing, the quiet between them gentle instead of suffocating. Jonah's presence settled over the room like a blanket itself, steady and warm. For the first time since stepping into the storm, Chris felt the tightness in his ribs ease enough to breathe without pain. After a while, Jonah reached into his pocket and placed a small handkerchief on the table. "For when the rain dries," he said with a faint smile. Chris managed a weak smile back. It felt strange on his face, like trying on an old coat that still fit but hadn't been worn in years. Outside, the storm softened into a whisper. Inside, the room glowed brighter, as if responding to the unraveling of despair. Jonah rose and began preparing a cot in the corner, smoothing the sheets with quiet reverence. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we can talk about what comes next." The words hit Chris with a strange mix of comfort and dread. Tomorrow. A future. Something he wasn't sure he still deserved, or even knew how to reach for. He watched Jonah for a moment, the older man's movements deliberate, patient, almost ritualistic. There was something in the way Jonah handled even the smallest task that hinted at a story he wasn't telling yet. And as Chris settled into the cot, the blanket tucked around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Jonah's kindness wasn't just habit. It felt like atonement, a truth waiting in the quiet. Chris awoke to the soft murmur of rain against the basement window, a gentle rhythm that no longer felt like accusation. The blanket around his shoulders smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the linen soap Jonah must have used to wash it. His body ached in places he hadn't realized were tense, muscles unclenching as though the storm of the night had seeped into his bones. For the first time since stepping into that rain-soaked street, he felt the fragile ease of safety. Yet even in warmth, a quiet unease clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. Jonah was already moving about the small room. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, steam spiraling toward the low ceiling. His hands worked with deliberate care, stacking bowls and wiping counters, each gesture precise yet unhurried. Chris watched him from the cot, absorbing the quiet discipline that seemed to tether the room. There was no hurry here, no expectation, just the rhythm of someone who had known hardship and chosen to meet it with steady hands. When Jonah finally looked up, his eyes softened. "Sleep well?" he asked, voice carrying a weight of experience, not patronization. Chris nodded, unsure if word could capture the mixture of relief and apprehension still coiling inside him. "Better," he murmured. "Thank you for last night." Jonah's lips curved slightly, a shadow of a smile. "It's nothing," he said, but the sincerity in his tone spoke volumes. "You were cold, hungry, and alone. That's all I did." Chris swallowed, the memory of his family's harshness striking him anew. Their words echoed in his mind. The accusations, the shame, the anger. Hey, in this basement, there were no judgments, no sharp edges, only quiet acknowledgment. It was unfamiliar, and yet painfully comforting. A small part of him feared that comfort, weary of trusting so easily after betrayal, had carved deep grooves into his heart. He rose from the cot, stretching stiff limbs. Each movement reminded him of the night's ordeal, the cold rain, the humiliation of being cast out. He hesitated by the small window, watching the city shimmer under the drizzle, reflections of neon and streetlights melting into the puddles. Somewhere beyond those lights, his family's home still stood, warm and vibrant with life he no longer belonged to. He had carried their burdens for years, and now the doors were closed to him, and the cold outside seemed to seep into memory as well. Jonah handed him a bowl of steaming oatmeal, the aroma rich with warmth and subtle sweetness. "Eat," he said simply. "You'll need strength before you face the day." Chris accepted it, hands trembling slightly. The heat radiated into him, breaking through the frost that lingered beneath his skin. Each bite was a revelation, a reminder that sustenance could exist without strings, without expectation. And yet, a question gnawed at him. Why did Jonah care so much for someone he barely knew? As he ate, Jonah pulled up a chair and sat facing him. "You've been carrying too much," he said softly. "It's clear from the way you move, the way your chest tightens even in warmth. You're weighed down by more than wet clothes and hunger." Chris paused, the spoon hovering near his mouth. He met Jonah's gaze and saw neither pity nor judgment, only recognition, as if the older man understood burdens invisible to others. It drew something out of him he had long suppressed, the part of him that wanted to be seen, understood, and still mattered. He wanted to tell Jonah about Mark, about love, about the life he had been denied at home. But the words felt fragile, too easily broken by truth. Instead, he said, I don't know what comes next. I've never been on my own." Jonah nodded, as if he had anticipated the fear. "None of us have, when it matters most. But you have to start somewhere. Step by step, not all at once." Chris swallowed the lump in his throat. It sounded simple, almost ordinary, yet the simplicity carried the weight of a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He realized he had been measuring his worth through others' eyes for too long, through bills paid, sacrifices made, obligations met. And now, alone but for Jonah's quiet presence, he had to start measuring himself by his own heart. Jonah's eyes softened further, glimmering with a depth that made Chris uneasy yet drawn in. "You've been hiding more than money," he said gently. "There's something I sense you're holding back." Chris flinched at the directness, words choking him. He wasn't ready to speak of Mark. Not here, not yet. Yet Jonah's gaze did not waver, patient and steady, an anchor in a world that had been untethered for far too long. Slowly, tentatively, Chris whispered, "It's complicated. I love someone, and it cost me everything." Jonah's hands rested lightly on his knees. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the confession to settle in the quiet space between them. Finally, he said, "Love is never simple, especially when others fear it or wish to control it. But it doesn't make you wrong. It makes you human." Chris felt a tremor in his chest, something like relief mixed with grief. No one had said that to him in years. Not his family, not the world outside. Only this man, quiet and steady, who had rescued him from the storm and offered something he had almost forgotten, acknowledgement without condition. The words also carried a truth he hadn't expected, one that made him pause. Jonah's eyes weren't just kind. They were weighted, thoughtful, almost burdened. Chris sensed that the older man had lived through something similar, had seen love punished, had known the sting of exile. And in that unspoken connection, a flicker of understanding passed between them. Jonah shifted slightly, leaning forward. "There's more to your story than just what's been taken from you tonight," he said softly. "I've known people who've been cast out for their hearts, and sometimes the cruelty they face is roots they never imagined." Chris's brow furrowed. "Roots?" The older man nodded. "Pain isn't always born from malice. Sometimes it's fear, shame, old wounds projecting themselves onto the innocent. That doesn't make it right, but it can help explain it. And understanding can be a tool not for forgiveness, but for clarity." Chris considered this, the words settling like snow on a frozen river. He realized he had been carrying anger and sorrow without understanding, assuming malice where fear had been at work. It didn't lessen the hurt, but it reframed the path ahead. Perhaps clarity, not revenge, would be his first step toward reclaiming himself. Jonah's eyes softened further. "Tonight, rest. Tomorrow, we start small. There's work to do, yes, but not just to survive. To live. To choose how you are seen, and by whom." Chris nodded, the weight of those words pressing and lifting at once. He felt the stirrings of something he hadn't dared imagine in a long time. Agency. Choice. Even hope. And yet, as he lay back on the cot, Jonah's gaze lingered on him, thoughtful and distant, as if he were weighing a secret he had not yet spoken. Chris couldn't read it, but he sensed that the night's calm was fragile, a pause before revelation. Something in Jonah's presence whispered that the story he had just begun was entwined with a hidden truth, one that might change everything he thought he knew about safety, trust, and the cost of love. And as he drifted toward sleep, one thought settled in his mind with insistent clarity. The journey ahead would demand courage, not just for survival, but for the truth he had yet to uncover. And whatever that truth was, it would test not only his heart but the fragile trust he had just begun to feel. Because Chris was no longer only fleeing the storm outside, he was about to confront a storm within, one that held the key to everything he had lost, and perhaps everything he might yet reclaim. Outside, rain pattered softly against the basement window, the city humming quietly beyond. Chris closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the blanket and the quiet vigilance of Jonah fill the room. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world waited, unforgiving, uncertain, and full of possibility. The morning light seeped through the basement window in thin, hesitant rays, casting long streaks across the worn wooden floor. Chris blinked awake, the warmth of the blanket around him a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in his bones. For a moment, the world felt safe, contained within these walls, away from the judgment, away from the sharp edges of his family's anger. But the quiet was brittle, and Chris knew it. Today, the calm would have to meet the storm. He rose carefully, muscles stiff, the weight of the past night pressing like a familiar vice. Jonah moved silently around the small space, carrying 2 steaming mugs, the aroma of strong coffee mingling with a lingering scent of damp wood and blankets. "Drink," Jonah said, handing one to him. His eyes held a quiet gravity that made Chris pause, as if the older man understood the decision that waited beyond the basement door. Chris wrapped his hands around the warm mug. The heat seeped into him slowly, breaking through the remnants of last night's cold. He took a measured sip, savoring the way it steadied his nerves. "I have to face them," he said quietly, voice uncertain, almost afraid of its own sound. "I can't hide forever." Jonah's eyes flicked to him, steady and unblinking. "You're right," he said gently. "But know this, you don't face them from a place of anger alone. You need your heart and your truth as armor." Chris nodded, the words settling in him like solid ground after the long night of storm and rain. He dressed slowly, Jonah watching with quiet patience, offering no judgment for the trembling in his hands or the pauses that lingered as he buckled his coat. Each movement was deliberate as if preparing for crossing into a territory that was both familiar and foreign. Home, yes, but poisoned by years of expectation and betrayal. By the time they stepped outside, the drizzle had lessened to a whisper, the street slick and shining in the early sunlight. Chris's shoes clung to the wet pavement, leaving dark prints behind him, echoes of the path he had walked alone the night before. He inhaled the damp air, lungs filling with clarity and determination. Today, he would not be a passive victim of their judgments. Today, he would reclaim a fragment of himself. The car ride to his family's neighborhood was quiet. Jonah drove with a practiced calm, his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. Chris's mind swirled with memories, sharp word from last night, the shattering of trust, the sting of being cast out. But alongside that, there was something new, a growing sense of purpose, fragile yet undeniable. He was not the same man who had left the house in the storm. He had seen kindness. He had felt warmth offered without expectation. That knowledge, small as it was, made the confrontation possible. They arrived at the house, familiar and oppressive, the windows reflecting the morning light with an almost mocking clarity. Chris paused at the gate, heart hammering, as a quiet street held its breath. Jonah reached out, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You're ready," he said simply. That small reassurance steadied him more than anything else could. Chris stepped onto the porch, boots sinking slightly into the damp wood. The front door loomed before him, polished, imposing, yet somehow hollow. He lifted his hand, trembling, and rapped on the frame. Silence. The sound echoed into the interior, a hollow drumbeat of expectation and fear. Moments later, the door opened. His father stood there, rigid, eyes narrowing at the figure on the doorstep. Beside him, his mother's face tightened, lines of worry and unspoken blame etched deep. His siblings lingered in the shadows, posture stiff, expressions guarded. Chris swallowed, feeling the tightness coil in his chest. But he remembered Jonah's words, heart and truth as armor. He drew in a shaky breath and stepped forward. "I need to speak," Chris said, voice firm despite the tremor. "All of you, please, listen." The house remained still. His father's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak, and that silence, heavy and loaded, was enough. Chris's gaze swept over them, taking in every furrow, every hesitation, every sign of fear masquerading as anger. He felt the years of burden, the bills, the sacrifices, the quiet labor of keeping them afloat, pressing into the moment. And now, for the first time, he refused to let those years define him without his voice attached. "I've spent my life giving," he began, each word deliberate, measured, cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Paying bills you wouldn't, covering debts you ignored, working shifts while you slept. And I did it because I loved you. I believed that family meant something more than words." His father's lips tightened, his eyes flicking away, but Chris pressed on. "But you made a choice last night that I cannot ignore. You told me I was a sin for loving another man. You told me my love erased all that I had done. And then you cast me out." His mother's hands trembled slightly at her sides. His siblings shifted uneasily. Chris's voice rose, not in anger, but in the steady pulse of truth. "Do you know what it feels like to give your all, only to have it counted as nothing? To have your very heart, the place where you hope to be loved, be declared wrong?" The house seemed to breathe around him, the ticking of a clock in the hallway marking each moment as he continued. "I am not a sin. I am not just money, not just a service, not just a provider. I am someone who loves, who hopes, who deserves dignity. And I will not let your fear define that." A long silence followed. Even the walls seemed to lean in, holding the tension. His father's shoulders sagged slightly, a fissure in the armor of authority. His mother blinked, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. His siblings looked away, unable or unwilling to meet his gaze. And in that stillness, Chris understood something he hadn't before. Confrontation was not about victory. It was about being seen, fully and unflinchingly, for the person he was, not the ledger of debts he carried. "You cast me out because you feared love," he said finally, voice softening, but not yielding. "You confused fear for righteousness. And tonight, I came back not for punishment, but for understanding. Not to demand apologies, but to demand acknowledgement." His father's lips parted, a soundless start of protest, but Chris held his gaze, unwavering. The words he spoke were not loud, but they carried weight, the steady insistence of someone who had endured, who had survived the storm, and who now demanded the simplest justice, recognition. And then, just as a faint tremor of hope touched the edges of the room, a soft click came from the hallway. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it drew every eye. Chris turned slightly, following the noise, and there, emerging from the shadows of the doorway, was someone he did not expect. A figure from the night before, a witness to his survival, whose presence suggested the story he had lived so far was entwined with secrets yet untold. The air shifted, heavy with anticipation, and Chris felt that the next revelation could change everything. The door creaked again, this time fully opening, and the figure from the hallway stepped into the light. Mark! The same gentle, quiet presence from the Riverside memory. Chris's chest tightened at the sight of him, the familiar face suddenly anchoring the storm that had raged for so long. Jonah remained behind, silent and steady, giving the two men space as if knowing this was a moment Chris had to claim himself. Mark's eyes met his, warm but firm. "Chris," he said softly, voice carrying the weight of 100 unspoken truths. "I came as soon as I could." There was no hesitation, no doubt, only unwavering support. Chris swallowed, feeling the swell of courage begin to rise inside him. The room, heavy with tension and judgment, suddenly held the possibility of reconciliation, not just with others, but with himself. His father's face tightened at the sight of Mark. "Who?" he began, but Chris lifted a hand, halting the word before they could cut through the fragile space Chris had built. "Is not here to fight," Chris said, voice calm, deliberate. "He is here to witness that I will not shrink, that I will not hide anymore." The room exhaled silently with him, each person caught in the gravity of the moment. His mother blinked, tears now fully forming, her hands twisting in front of her. His siblings shifted, unsure where to place their judgment, their anger or their loyalty. Chris felt the past years of sacrifice, of invisibility, of silent endurance, pressing into him, and he stepped forward, each movement steady, unwavering. "I have loved, and I will continue to love," Chris said, voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in truth. "I have provided, yes, but I am not defined solely by what I give. I am a person, whole and flawed and deserving. Every act of care, every late-night worry, every sacrifice, it came from who I am, not just what I could afford. And tonight, I claim that." His words resonated in the room, bouncing off the walls, filling the space with a presence that had long been absent, the unflinching self of a man who had weathered storms. His father's hand trembled slightly at his side. "Chris, we—" His voice faltered, cracking as it had never before, revealing a fissure behind the armor of anger. "We only—" He stopped, eyes darting away. The truth was too sharp, too sudden. The weight of his own fear and pride pressed upon him, the realization that he had equated love with wrongness. The room fell into a tense silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the street beyond. Chris stepped closer, feeling the years of rejection and accusation transform into resolve. "You called me a sin," he said quietly, but each word carried an undeniable strength. "You judged my heart without seeing it, without understanding it. But I am more than the fear you clung to for so long. And so is love." He looked to Mark, then back to the family who had once measured him by his wallet alone. "And I will not apologize for that." The siblings exchanged glances, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the anger in their eyes began to crack. His sister's hands unclenched, fingers brushing the doorframe. His brother's jaw relaxed, the hardness in his stance softening. Even his mother's lips parted, hesitant, as though forming words she had buried too long. Chris felt the shift, subtle but undeniable. The air itself had changed. The energy of judgment had been met with the gravity of truth, and the balance had begun to tip. Mark stepped forward then, closing the distance between them. "Chris isn't asking for permission," he said, calm but unwavering. "He's asking for acknowledgement. And I—" His gaze swept the room slowly, deliberately, meeting each pair of eyes. "I stand with him." The simplicity of the statement, paired with a quiet certainty in Mark's voice, carried a weight that could not be ignored. A silence followed, pregnant with the potential for either fracture or repair. Chris inhaled deeply, feeling his chest expand as courage replaced fear. He knew that reconciliation might not come quickly, that understanding might take years, but this moment was his, and he would not relinquish it. He took a small step toward his father. "I'm still your son," he said, voice soft but steady. "Not because of money, not because of obligation, not because of what I provide. I'm your son because I exist, because I love, because I have always tried to care. And that hasn't changed." For a heartbeat, the house remained motionless. The sunlight caught in the corners of the room, glinting off the polished floorboards like shards of hope. His father's eyes softened slightly, the rigidity of authority bending, if only a fraction, under the weight of Chris's words. Chris's mother's shoulders slumped as tears ran freely, silent but full of meaning. His siblings looked on, a mix of confusion, awe, and something else, recognition. Recognition that he had always been more than the sum of his sacrifices. Jonah, still standing near the doorway, gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible, as though the moment was exactly as it needed to be. His presence had been a quiet pillar, and now it receded, letting Chris claim the center of the room, the center of his story. Chris exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest loosening, the storm within him beginning to ebb. "I forgive you," he said, almost in a whisper, but firm enough to carry across the space. "Not for everything, not yet, but for today, for seeing me now." His voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. This tremor was a release of years of suppression, the sound of someone finally unburdened. His father stepped forward slowly, reaching out a hand that hovered uncertainly. "Chris," he murmured, voice soft. I didn't understand. I was afraid. And his words faltered, but the intention was clear. The armor of pride had cracked enough for light to enter. Chris extended his own hand, meeting his father's halfway. There was no grand gesture, no sudden, miraculous forgiveness, just a quiet, deliberate act of connection, a bridge, thin but unbroken, forming across the chasm of years. His mother joined, placing a tentative hand on his arm, warmth seeping into him where cold had held dominion for so long. His siblings lingered, watching, and slowly, carefully, one stepped forward. Then another. Mark smiled faintly from the side, silent encouragement in his eyes. Jonah's presence remained at the edge, a quiet guardian witnessing the fragile reunion. The room breathed, and in that collective exhale, Chris felt something he hadn't for a long time. Home, not as a place of obligation, but as a space where love could exist without fear. Chris sank into a chair briefly, letting the gravity of the moment settle around him. The sunlight shifted again, cutting across the room in golden lines. Dust motes floated in the beams, tiny witnesses to a reconciliation that had been decades in the making, compressed into minutes of honesty, courage, and presence. He looked at Mark, then at Jonah, then back at his family. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, voice gentle. "But I know that today we begin." There was no finality, only a door opening to possibility, the first fragile step in a journey that might never fully erase the scars but could weave them into something resembling understanding. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain-washed streets, a whisper of renewal. Chris felt it brush his cheek as though affirming that change, even the smallest, could be real. And in the quiet aftermath, he realized that the power to shape the next chapter rested not in forgiveness alone, nor in wealth, nor in fear, but in the courage to stand unflinching and claim his own life. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing even when you are. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, someone's still fighting their storm, and your kindness might be the light they need. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.